Are frozen embryos actually children? No. But before you freak out, let me explain. Frozen embryos occupy this legal no man's land, not because the science is unclear, but because lawmakers have avoided the question deliberately for decades. And now, technology is forcing that question to the surface, and we can't avoid it anymore. I'm Emma Waters, and it's time to start rethinking fertility. So to dive into this topic, we're going to look at 3 areas. First, what the science actually says. Second, we're going to look at the way that we have had a patchwork of state laws governing frozen embryos that have deliberately avoided the most important question. And finally, we're going to look at the way that new emerging technological developments are going to force a serious reckoning among pro-lifers and pro-choicers alike when it comes to how we're thinking about frozen embryos in the United States. But before we go any further, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel, hit like, leave us a review, a 5-star review at that, and share this with some of your friends. It goes a long way in helping us get this information into the hands of people who need it, and we would really appreciate it. So let's hop in. When most people come into this debate about what frozen embryos are, there's the assumption that it's actually really murky, and there's a lot of debate among at least scientists as to when life begins or life really counts. But the reality is actually far more clear and direct. We actually know that a human embryo's life begins the moment that that egg and sperm unite and create this genetically complete and distinct human embryo that's never existed before. So some of you have maybe seen the zinc spark video on social media where you see sperm enter the egg and this flash of light appears on the screen. And it's like this incredible, beautiful thing. Whether you're a pro-lifer, pro-choicer, or somewhere in between, you can recognize something profound has just happened. What science does not debate is the fact that a new life has begun. There's something called developmental systems theory. And this is one of the most widely accepted models in biology because it describes the human embryo as a self-organizing human organism, not a collection of human cells. But the human embryo is an organism that actually directs its growth. It's self-directing. It's not reliant on outside forces to force that development to take place as long as it's in the right environment. And so this distinction matters a lot, and it's worth really diving into here. So first, a skin cell is human, right? If you take some of my skin cell, you'll say, yes, this belongs to a human. But left alone, it doesn't grow or change or turn into anything else. A tumor is also human tissue, right? And in this case, it grows, but it's disorganized and it's not leading to life or creating a new life as much as it is just sucking the life out of your body. Unlike a mere skin cell or a tumor, a human embryo is a self-directing system with an inherent developmental trajectory. One of the ways of sort of summarizing this came from Maureen Kondik. She's this incredible ethicist and biologist, and she says that the embryo is not a potential person. It is a person with potential. So I'll read that one more time. She says, the human embryo is not a potential person. It is a person with potential. Aside from that one moment when the human embryo is actually formed for the first time, there is no clear, clean break in the rest of that human embryo's development that would be an easier point to argue, well, now it has moral value versus it not having moral value before. Because at every other stage, it's just a stage of development. It's not a truly new thing happening. But that's the continuum of life. So for example, if you try to say, well, a baby who is 8 weeks along versus 20 weeks along, one of them has moral value, one of them doesn't. Again, you're creating an arbitrary line where there's no meaningful difference between the two, except one's just a little more developed. And yet, in almost every single state and in the federal government, the human embryo is not considered a person, but merely property. But this brings us to the second point of the podcast, because for the past 30 to 40 years, Courts, when they've been faced with a question of what is the human embryo and how do we think about it, have really dropped the ball and frankly tried to avoid this question as much as possible. So for a long time under Roe v. Wade, which said that there is a constitutional right to an abortion, erroneously, thankfully that was overturned, but in doing so said that the unborn child and therefore the human embryo created in IVF was not a person, it was only property. And so for a long time, that's just how the law thought about it. But as you can imagine, even if you're not a pro-life parent, if you are undergoing IVF in hopes of having a baby, there are ample examples of those parents realizing that they think of their human embryos as their children. Even if they're not pro-life or wouldn't even want to follow it to its logical conclusion, there's something about the human embryo that they value in a distinct way than they would property. And so one of the most consequential state Supreme Court decisions that's ultimately come out on this issue was Davis v. Davis. This was in Tennessee in 1992. There was a couple, they had used IVF, they had frozen embryos left over, but then the couple was going through a divorce. The parents actually disagreed about what to do with the human embryos that were left over. So the wife, or the ex-wife in this case, wanted to keep the human embryos and implant them in her own body and give them a chance at life. These were her children. She wanted the chance to have those children, and it wasn't good enough for her just to destroy them. The husband, on the other hand, didn't want to use the human embryos, and he didn't want them potentially being born because he did not want to be a father. And so ultimately, they weren't able to work it out. It went to court. And there's been a few different ways that the courts have made these decisions, but in Davis v. Davis, they did something really interesting where they said, okay, it would be wrong and inappropriate in some degree for us to call these human embryos mere property, because clearly this is different than what do we do with a leftover car? But at the same time, the court was very uncomfortable with ultimately deciding that these human embryos were mere persons, because if they were persons, then that would be a complete rethinking of the way we have governed human embryos in the United States. So instead, the court came to this middle ground where they said that human embryos are not merely property, but they're not persons. They're this special category of special property. They basically came to the conclusion that we need to treat the human embryo with a special respect, that it's unlike the car that we have split up between the couple, but it's not quite a person. And that middle ground has governed much of our laws governing human embryos when it comes to these marital disputes ever since. And the last court case that I'll mention here was the Alabama decision in 2024. Because this is the one that I think really put IVF on the national map and has made a lot of the conversations that we're having here possible in the public eye. So in 2024, there were frozen embryos that were being stored at a fertility clinic, but that fertility clinic was connected to a hospital. So one day, a mentally unwell person from the hospital stumbled into the fertility clinic, and for some reason, the door to the fertility clinic, the door to the storage room, and the door to the freezer where these human embryos were kept were all left unlocked, a clear case of negligence on the fertility clinic's part. Well, that mentally unwell person opened the freezer where the human embryos were being stored and pulled out a metal tray. But because they're kept at sub-zero temperatures, the moment that person touched the tray, it burned their hand and they dropped an entire tray of frozen human embryos. And they shattered on the ground immediately, completely destroying all of them. Well, when the parents found out about this, they were crushed. There's no indication that these parents are pro-life or have any particular stance one way or the other, but they did say, well, we're the parents, the owners of these human embryos. These were our children. This was our attempt at having children. And so simply being told by the fertility clinic that, well, we'll reimburse you for lost property wasn't sufficient. The parents actually wanted to be, they wanted to be recognized as having lost their children. So at the end of the day, what Alabama did is they said, well, we have a law on the books that says if a parent files the wrongful death of a minor claim, either because someone attacks a pregnant woman or something happens in that space, that child from the moment of conception in the womb is considered a person for the sake of a wrongful death of a minor statute. So what the Alabama Supreme Court said was, well, the location of the human embryo from the moment of conception shouldn't determine whether or not it falls under that wrongful death statute or not. So they said that these parents, in the case of filing a wrongful death of a minor statute, could consider the human embryos persons. Now, the headline simply said Alabama has ruled all frozen embryos persons, but they actually didn't go that far. They just said in the case of a wrongful death of a minor statute, you could sue on the grounds of a person, whether the human embryo was in the womb or in a petri dish. And so the parents won that case and were able to hold the fertility clinic accountable accordingly. This decision in Alabama is actually a huge win for the pro-life movement because it was one step closer to recognizing human embryos for what they are, humans. But unfortunately, the backlash, both in Alabama and nationally, was so severe that Republican lawmakers were quickly jumping over themselves to try to undo or minimize the consequences. And so within a mere couple of weeks of this decision coming out, they actually passed a state law giving all fertility clinics in Alabama complete civil and criminal immunity for whatever happens in the course of IVF. So they didn't undo the ruling of the Supreme Court, but they did say that if in the future a fertility clinic negligently leaves their doors unlocked and a mentally unwell person walks in and destroys someone's human embryos, that fertility clinic has complete immunity, and those parents can't even sue for lost property. That's insane. It's actually far more insane than any other state has ever gone when it comes to undermining parental rights in the course of IVF, not to mention the impact this has on protecting human embryos created through the industry. So I want to zoom out a little bit and look at the pattern across all the states that these varying cases have established and just go through that with you very briefly. So first, we've seen across the last 30 to 40 years that courts consistently refuse to say what an embryo is. The courts focus on resolving the immediate dispute through contracts, balancing tests, or other procedural workarounds. So instead of establishing a single framework to govern this, they'll say, okay, well, in this one specific scenario that's come to our court, how can we navigate this in a way that makes both parties happy, but doesn't say too much about the issue as a whole? It always comes down to adult intentions or interests, or governed by the previously signed contracts that those adults had entered into. So no court is actually asking, well, what is in the best interest of this human embryo? So even on a case-by-case basis, the outcomes are varying widely between these cases, depending on the specific factors, the judges, and the state that they're in. And the other thing that I mentioned earlier, but I think is worth highlighting, is that many of these disputes often occur after divorce or separation between the married couple. And it always comes down to one parent who wants to give the child a chance at life and the other parent who doesn't want to. And interestingly, Arizona is the only state that has a law in place that actually automatically sides with the parent who wants to give the embryos a chance at life. In every other state, unless decided differently by an individual judge in an individual case, the state assumes the right to not procreate, meaning the parent who doesn't want to use the human embryos, who wants the human embryos either frozen indefinitely or destroyed, is the assumed, quote, winner of the dispute. Which is wild on so many levels, but that was the precedent set by Roe v. Wade, which was the assumption that you could not procreate or destroy the life of the child versus becoming the parent. And then the final example that I want to point out here is the story of Hannah Strege. So she was actually the first adopted frozen embryo who was successfully born and is now walking and talking and advocating for other human embryos who were in the same situation. And so she worked with the Justice Foundation to submit an amicus brief to the Supreme Court for the Dobbs decision, which ultimately overturned Roe v. Wade. And the case that she made was that she, as a frozen embryo, was a viable person outside the womb before she was ever transferred. And what was Roe v. Wade based on? Well, the question of viability, that a child becomes a child with legal protections once it's viable outside the womb. And Hannah made a really clever argument where she said, well, as a frozen embryo, embryo. I was actually viable outside the womb. I was still living. I was frozen. I wasn't developing yet, but I was still viable. And the moment she was placed inside her mother, she continued to grow and was born as a live human being. So all taken together, what this gives us is a patchwork approach across different cases and different states. And what I find the most frustrating is I think this is a prime example of legislators, of judges, and frankly, the public as a whole abdicating their responsibility. It leaves parents undergoing IVF and frozen embryos constantly in a state of legal uncertainty. And it happens at least a few times a year that something goes wrong and either a fertility clinic freezer fails or parents go to court, and we have to ask the question again and again and again, what rights and protections do the parents have, and what rights and protections do the human embryos have? But because we refuse to answer that question head on, it just restarts the process time and time again and has become a legal nightmare for anyone who's trying to navigate this. But this brings us to our third and final point from today's conversation, is that emerging technologies, not technologies that I necessarily endorse, but emerging technologies that are here and coming nonetheless, are making this evasion more and more difficult. So one of the interesting examples of this actually came out of the Alabama Supreme Court decision. In a footnote, one of the justices said, well, what about artificial womb technology? Right now, we're just testing out partial ectogenesis, where a baby around 20 to 21 weeks of gestation could be transferred potentially to a partial artificial womb to finish its development. But the judge said, what happens when we develop the technology such that an artificial womb can actually gestate a human embryo from the moment of conception all the way to birth? The justice in this case pointed out that most state laws will either say that a human person is a person if they're born from a biological womb. But what happens if persons are born through artificial wombs? Are they no longer persons? And I think all of us would say, well, of course they're a child. We know they're a child. But our current legal frameworks actually wouldn't say that. And so we're going to have to start rethinking the way we've established our laws to account for this technology. And there's two other technological developments that I think are pressing this point as well. There's something called in vitro gametogenesis, or IVG. There are scientists who have successfully done this on mice and are testing it on humans, where they're taking a skin cell, a little bit of blood, or even a follicle of your hair, and then genetically transforming it from that skin cell into a viable egg or sperm. So think about that. Scientists could hypothetically take a skin cell from my finger or a piece of my hair and genetically modify it into an egg, so that they wouldn't actually need literal eggs from my body to create humans through IVF. And then the extra insane part is they're also experimenting with taking my own skin cells as a biological woman and genetically modifying it into a viable sperm. Now that's like next level, because it would enable the creation of asexual persons, where I could use my eggs and then my skin cells genetically transformed into a sperm to create human embryos that are 100% related to me. Think about same-sex couples. A gay couple could use the sperm of one man and then genetically modify a skin cell from the other man into a viable egg, and then they could create a human embryo that was 100% related to two men. So think about that. The implications of this are insane, and not in a good way, in a very, very, very bad, depraved way, to say the least. And for one final example on this, think about your favorite celebrity crush, like Leonardo DiCaprio, adorable smile, great hair, good eyes. Well, imagine if you are just like on set with Leonardo DiCaprio and you see one of his hairs fall out and sit on his chair. What IVG technology technically enables, and it hasn't successfully been done on humans, but they are experimenting actively to this end, is that you as the producer could grab Leo's hair, take it to a clinic and say, yeah, I have permission to use this, or yeah, this is totally fine. And then those scientists could genetically modify Leonardo DiCaprio's hair into a viable egg or sperm that you could use to have a child that is 50% biologically related to Leonardo DiCaprio. And you might be thinking, well, that's amazing because I would love to have a celebrity baby. And that means you probably need some mental health and should just go be meeting with a professional, because that's insane to literally genetically modify without someone's knowledge and have what is technically their baby, but is it even their baby? Our laws have no way of navigating it. Still technically hypothetical, but frankly, it's not that far off. So the last example that I want to get into is the creation of synthetic human embryos. So these synthetic human embryos are not created using egg or sperm, and there is no moment of conception. Stem cells are genetically modified to create an entity that resembles a human embryo. And this is often done for the sake of harvesting stem cells for research or for the creation of different drugs. And it's an incredibly complicated legal and moral zone to get into. And it's something that we should talk about a lot more later, because in many ways, I'm still thinking through how I, as a Christian and pro-lifer, even want to approach the question of these synthetic human embryos that are human embryos in a real sense. They reach early developmental milestones, but at the same time, there's no egg or sperm involved. There's no conception. It's just really insane. And again, not insane in a good way. They wouldn't have any rights because even personhood and pro-life laws are written based on fertilization. All of these emerging technologies that I've referenced on this podcast, while I am not endorsing any of them, reveal the weakness of our current case-by-case patchwork approach to governing what a human embryo is and what protections or rights they have. And this is why the organization behind this podcast is producing a documentary on this very subject titled Frozen Orphans. At the heart of this film is the story of Hannah Strege, whom we discussed earlier in this episode. She's the first child adopted as a frozen embryo, and her story is simply amazing. You can learn more about the film and the incredible pro-life advocacy of this organization by going to frozenorphans.org. Thanks for watching. My name is Emma Waters. Join me next time as we continue rethinking fertility.
All sources are cited in the show notes found in the description of this episode.